Hello slot racers, welcome to another CleveTech Tech Tips video. It's going to be a bit of a short one today, no pun intended, but we're going to look at braid length and how it affects our slot car. So with a race coming up in the UK, I better get round to preparing some braids. So I've got a few here. Now I've covered some of these techniques in a previous video, but had some questions about certain things. So we're going to go through that today and also talk about the length of the braid. So let's get started. So as I've covered before, we take our braid. This is a prime braid. I'm going to get rid of the pimple on the top by squashing it in a pair of pliers. I am going to trim the clip slightly shorter with a little pair of side cutters, like that. Then I'm going to flatten out the braid with maybe an old axle, or this is an old Allen wrench. So I'm going to flatten out the braid. Running a long braid, turning the braid over, doing both sides of the braid. You can just see that in the corner of the picture. Then going to check the thickness of my braid. This one, see, works out thinner than the braid I did in the other video. The braid I used in the other video, I think, was a big mama type braid, but this one's thinning out at about 060, 062 millimeters. If you want that in inches, it's about 23, 24 thou. There we go. So after it's thinned, we can then bend the clip. So again, I'm going to use my little piece of piano wire, bend the clip over, and then just flatten it out a little bit with my pliers. Not too much. I don't want to crush the end because I want it to be a nice tight fit in the guide. Make sure that the clip sits perfectly straight and hasn't bent slightly sideways. And then we come to the crucial bit. Let's trim it and get it ready. So in my previous video, I used a little tool like this, but I had one made of aluminium. But trouble is with that tool that I had previously is I couldn't get the braids the right length that I wanted. They were either too short and I couldn't quite get them long enough for brand new braids. So I decided to make my own little tool here. So these are also available through CleveTech. You can go to my Facebook page, send me a message or send me an email. Details are down below. So this little tool here, it has little divisions on the side. Hopefully you can see those, so that you can accurately reposition this and get your braids to be whatever length you want. So I've set it to roughly that middle mark there. I'll let you know how long it is in a minute. So the idea is that you can put your braid in the little channel. It should stick out over the end slightly. Take your pair of scissors and you can trim the end of your braid off. I'm going to do this over, where have I put my little tray? Over my little tray, so I don't make a mess everywhere. So you can trim your braid off to length. And that way, when you're doing a whole series of braids, you can make sure that they are all the same length and they're all going to be consistent when you put them on the car. So the length of this braid is, just as a rough guide, there we are, 980, 0.980 in inches, or 24.8, 24.9 millimeters. So once I've used my CleveTech braid trimmer to get the braid to the right length, I can then just roughen up the end of the braid a little bit, just to open up the braiding. So this one's quite tightly woven, this braid, this type of braid. So if I open up the weave a little bit, it helps make better contact on the track. So again, I'm going to use my little wire brush. You can use other types of wire brush. As I said, this one's just really nice because it's got quite wide spikes in it, and it actually opens the braid up quite nicely at the end. So notice I'm holding the braid just with a little bit of the end of the braid exposed, running the brush over the end of the braid. Do it both sides of the braid to open up the weave of the braid, like that, just on the end. And then you can just bring the braid back together again, like that. And there we have a braid. Now that's pretty much done. That'll be ready to go in the car. Sometimes I might just trim off if any little strands have come out the end of the braid. When I've done that, I might just neaten it up and just trim off any tiny strands that have pulled out the end of the braid. But that's a braid that's ready. So I said we'd discuss some braid length now, didn't I? Well, this is about as long as I would like to go. I would not prepare my braids any longer than that, because if you prepare your braids longer than that, then you might find that they stick out the end of the guide. So here's the one that I did the other day. You can see the braids are actually absolute maximum length. Yeah, I wouldn't want to go any longer than that, because then they'd start to stick out the back of the guide. But I may very well go shorter than this. But this tool, as it's suitable for all sorts of slot racing, you might go for much longer braids. You could even go for much shorter braids. So there's quite a bit of adjustment in this tool for how you want the length of your braid. Some discussion points. Thinking about it, obviously longer braid, if it hangs over the back of the guide, it runs the risk of touching. It also runs the risk of, when the guide turns, of shorting out on your chassis. So if the braid is too long, you can find that it can short behind the guide tab and short out on your chassis, which you don't want. So you want to make sure the braids are at least, about 1 millimetre shorter than the guide, I would say. But having longer braids gives you a much bigger contact area. So you do get very good pickup, especially if you've got a taped track or a rail track, something like that, where the contact surface is not that great. Maybe there's some gaps in the contact surface. Even braided track where the braid is really worn, longer braids can really help. And obviously, if the braid is having trouble making contact anyway, it's going to get warm. Or if you're drawing a lot of current through the braid because you've got a really powerful motor in your car, it's going to get very warm. So longer braid helps with cooling as well. But there are some downsides to having longer braid. It's more likely to get damaged in accidents. If you crash, the braids get spread apart and they're a hell of a mess. Also, there's a lot more drag on the braid because it's making a lot more contact. So especially braid on braid produces quite a bit of drag on a slot car track. So the longer the braid, the more drag you get. But they do last longer because obviously they can arc away and they can wear away and wear away. So a longer braid could actually get you through the whole race, possibly. Another rule I would say is make your braids the same length if you possibly can. I have seen some braids where people have done a race and they've got one braid that's half the length of the other braid. Now that's not going to work very well when the car's sitting in the slot on the track and you've got one braid here, one braid there. You'll end up with upsetting the front of the car and there'll be more pressure on one side than the other. The balance of the car will not be right. So make sure your braids are the same length. So what about going shorter? Well, I don't know whether you've seen, but sometimes wing car racers run very short braids. Well, there is a bit of a reason for that, especially when they're qualifying, because they want to reduce the amount of drag. So a shorter braid can dramatically reduce the amount of drag you get. But there is a lot of pressure on the car with wing cars, on the nose of the car. So again, any drag you can reduce there against the track will help your top speed, etc. But it's a compromise because again, you get less contact area, less current conduction, so the pickup isn't quite as good. But in accidents, shorter braids are less likely to get damaged. You know, the ends of a shorter braid, if you're running, let's say 5mm shorter than this, then again, it's less likely to get messed up in an accident. But shorter braids will run hotter because again, the contact area is not so large and there's not as much mass of copper to dissipate the heat. So again, slot racing, it's a bit of a compromise and you can try different things out, see how you get on. But as I say, I would start with braids fairly long, see how it goes. Maybe you might want to take some older braids that are slightly worn. I mean, this braid here has seen a bit of action. So maybe if you've got some older braids, you could trim them really short, try them out. Again, do a lap, see if the timings change. But there's so many other factors. Make sure your thickness is the same, make sure your ride height's the same. There's lots of other things that could affect your lap time other than just your braids. Something else to mention as well is with longer braids, obviously you can squash the braid, and as you squash the braid, you can make it thicker. So with a longer braid, you've got more chance to change the ride height of your car during a period of a race, assuming the braids aren't burning away. So obviously, if you were to take your braid in a lane change and you were to squash your braid a bit like this and make it slightly shorter, then in effect now you've made that braid thicker and you've changed your ride height slightly of your car. So you could lift the front up on certain lanes or later on in the race when there's more rubber on the track. So longer braids give you that opportunity to do that, whereas shorter braids might be slightly more difficult. Also, remember to put always a little kink in the back of the braid, like so, because it picks up better at the rear than at the front. Hope you've enjoyed this little short braid tutorial today and enjoy your slot racing. See you next week. Keep watching, keep subscribing, and more videos to come very soon.